So I now have the privilege of introducing you to our 2021 Sefton-Williams Memorial Lecture speaker, Dr. Ewan McGaughey. Ewan is a reader in law at King's College in London, and he joined King's College full-time in 2014 after completing a PhD at the London School of Economics, the school that was founded by two of my heroes, Sidney and Beatrice Webb, the grandmother and grandfather of industrial relations. He's also a research associate at the University of Cambridge Center for Business Research, and he teaches each year at the Paris School of Economics. He's a volunteer for the Free Representation Unit, and he has held visiting positions at the University of California, Berkeley, Fukuoka University, and the University of Sydney. And his topic today really couldn't be more timely. In fact, when we were talking at the Sefton-Williams Committee, a selection committee for the lecture speaker, Ewan's name came up immediately as somebody who would be able to say something that was really important for the current moment in time. I think that COVID has laid bare the tension points in our advanced industrialized democracies and has highlighted that now more than ever, we need to ensure that all people have a meaningful voice in the decisions that affect their lives. And so I'm really looking forward to Ewan's talk. Note that Ewan will speak for approximately 40 minutes, after which I'll moderate a question and answer period. And the audience will be able to submit your questions to ask during the talk using the Q&A function that you see on the bottom of your screen. And I promise I will try to get to as many questions as I can. So with that, please join me in warmly welcoming Dr. Ewan McGaughey.
Thank you so much, Dion, for that introduction. Thank you to the Centre and to all the organisers for organising this event. Congratulations to John and Ken, and I couldn't be happier to be here. I'm really thrilled. So it's for me an honour and a privilege to give this year's Sefton-Williams Lecture and to be able to pay tribute to Larry Sefton and Lynn Williams, two towering figures of the towering United Steelworkers of America. I'll say more about the steelworkers soon. But let me start by saying that although we're doing this lecture by video, and I can't be physically with you in Canada today, I'm reminded that my grandmother was Canadian and that I'm connected to you not just by the internet, but by history. My mother's parents met during World War II when Stan was sent from Britain for training in the Royal Air Force. And in New Brunswick, he met Stella, who was working as a teacher and then a typist for the war effort. They fell in love, and at the end of the war, they were lucky enough to reunite. So for me, these are glimmers of light in darker times, because the fight against fascism that Stella and Stan and Larry and Lynn lived through was not just about defeating a man with a silly mustache and flailing arms. It was also about overcoming an economic vision that concentrated all power into the hands of so-called leaders. Before these leaders bankrupted Germany and launched their campaign to enslave the world, the Nazis imprisoned the unions, conscripted the labor force, invented the idea of reprivatization of enterprise, entrenched monopolies and cartels, and concentrated shareholder votes, the commanding heights of the economy, into the hands of banks. All of this followed the leadership principle, or das Führerprinzip. As one crazed Nazi lawyer put it, democracy of capital will vanish, just as it did in politics. Now, I start with this because after the war, the very aim of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, what Eleanor Roosevelt called the Magna Carta of all, was to uproot the spirit of fascism at its source. As Franklin Delano Roosevelt put it, to return to the so-called normalcy of before would have been to have yielded to the spirit of fascism. For my family, the silver lining of that terrible war was that it brought my grandparents together. And for the world, the golden rules became freedom of speech and belief and freedom from want and from fear. This was the second attempt after the ill-fated Versailles Treaty, written during another global pandemic a century ago, recalled that peace can only be established when it is based upon social justice. The Versailles Treaty failed, based as it was on perpetual debt, not perpetual peace, but it left us the International Labour Organization. And when the Universal Declaration was written, it put labour rights, democracy, and social justice at its core. As it says, everyone has the right to take part in government, to just and favorable remuneration. And we all owe each other a duty to build a society where the free and full development of our personality is possible. It's a constant inspiration for our laws worldwide. But we also know that fascism in the Americas, in Europe, in Asia, in Africa, remains a clear and present danger. The United States has stared a sort of fascism light in the face for the last 4 years at least. And so to realize the values of the Universal Declaration, we have more work to do. We are crossing a temporary stage of humanity because we're all bearing witness to what this defective social system does. And it's one unlikely to last if we want to solve humanity's greatest problems: escalating inequality, climate damage, and war. So the case that I want to make to you today is that part of the solution is already there. And this is to play out the next act in the future of democracy. And that's to secure the right to vote in every social institution. The right to vote, as an old judge once said, is a most transcendent thing. It is at once the voice of the individual, their expression of freedom, and a mode of collective action. It's the way that we affirm both our autonomy and the social nature of our existence. We all understand our political constitution. We know the principle of one person, one vote. And what we're witnessing now is a new suffrage movement for the extension of the right to vote in our economic constitution: votes at work, votes in capital, and votes in public services. Our problems exist because we're not democratic enough. Inequality, climate damage, and war don't exist entirely, but mainly because corporations are dominated by asset managers and banks on Wall Street and Bay Street, in the city or in Frankfurt, and they're unaccountable to us. Their psychopathic drive for unlimited profit, whatever the social cost, whatever the negligence and profusion, will probably end soon, so long as we put good models before us to maintain a clear vision of democracy and justice on a living planet. Out of COVID-19, we need a green recovery and a social recovery. We also need a political recovery. So that's my central argument today, that we can become democratic and that we will create justice on a living planet when we end the financialization of our economy. But I've also got 3 main points. So first, at work and in all fields of social life, the basis of social relations is shifting from contract to membership, and this mirrors a shift from a society based on property to one based on universal human rights. Second, our right to vote in the economy, at work, in capital, and public services is already there in our most successful enterprises, particularly universities like Toronto, Cambridge, Oxford, or Harvard. All credible empirical evidence, quantitative, qualitative, and behavioral, shows that the vote is key to productivity, innovation, equality, and happiness. And this is becoming the goal of labour unions and of democratic, labour, liberal, and conservative politics. Indeed, every form of politics except fascism. Third, rival theories of economic governance, which advocate the monopolization of power by shareholders, the monopolization of shareholder rights by asset managers and banks, or the attempt to turn workers into shareholders, are total failures. So I want to persuade you not just that our current model is broken, though it certainly is, but that the alternatives that we see and know for a better life can be won. We have the technology now and the understanding now to write a new chapter in human freedom. Like a great farm workers unionist once said, yes, we can, and create a paradise on earth. But before I get to that, I want to invite you back in time, through the ages of revolutions and to the worlds of property and contract. Toronto and a new town of York was just being founded in the Mississauga's lands. The United States had just declared independence and ratified its first constitution, and France had declared the rights of man and of citizen. These were, or there were, and there remain many justifications for human rights, that they are self-evident, natural, inalienable, and sacred, or like the unwritten and unfailing statutes of heaven. By contrast, opponents, like Jeremy Bentham, believed that rights were just nonsense upon stilts. Nothing was inalienable, and that was a position that may have seemed more justified as the guillotines in Paris began to fall. But another voice was Mary Wollstonecraft, one of the most articulate of the age. She argued in A Vindication of the Rights of Woman that rights and duties, the laws which bind society, come not from the sky and not on stilts, but come from our virtue, our reason, and our knowledge. In her age, she argued, or she said, that from the respect paid to property flow, as from a poisoned fountain, most of the evils and vices which render this world such a dreary scene to the contemplative mind. And so for this contemplative mind, property and universal rights were opposites. Property was for the few, rights were for all. And in 1792, property was denied to people based on gender and race. You could not have property when you were property. Property still conferred rights to vote in politics, and it also meant economic enfranchisement because it was the source of bargaining power. As Adam Smith said in the Britain's Industrial Revolution, anyone who had property, like employers over workers, could hold out longer in any negotiation. Both politically and economically, property was still the passport to participation in society. So we all know the story quite well of how we won the vote in politics by dismantling the property and class qualifications and barriers based on gender and race. We also know of Henry Maine's adage that in the economy, the movement to progressive societies was from status to contract. Less familiar is how we kept requiring property to vote in companies. And if you were a worker with a contract, your investment of labor was not enough. The great enemies of democracy in the 19th century understood this very well. Robert Lowe, later the British Chancellor, led the opposition to lowering the property qualification to vote in Parliament in 1867. And he has also been described as the father of modern company law. He called the right of property owners to incorporate an aspect of human liberty, but he fiercely opposed extending the vote in Parliament because, as he said, that principle of democracy, if you let it in there, would have to be applied to all other social institutions, including companies. And as he put it, the elite of the working classes, which you are so fond of, are members of trade unions, founded on the principles of most grinding tyranny. It was only necessary, he said, that you should give them the franchise to make those trade unions the most dangerous political agencies that could be conceived. Lowe lost the fight, and trade unions won freedom to collectively bargain. But our corporate laws kept on equating property and the vote. There were exceptions. In the quiet recesses of Oxford in 1852, the teachers were in revolt. They set up a commission to reverse what they called successive interventions by which the government of the university was reduced to a narrow oligarchy. And on its recommendation, the Oxford University Act of 1854 required that university fellows had the right to elect a majority of the university council. In 2 years, Cambridge did the same. Of course, neither corporation was fully democratic, still excluding junior or non-academics, yet the right to vote came from membership at work, not by a contract to invest property. So as the Industrial Revolution moved into the corporate revolution, the calls for industrial democracy, as Dion said from Sidney and Beatrice Webb at the LSE, it grew. But when the International Labour Organization was founded in 1919, there wasn't one model of what industrial democracy meant, but three. First, number one, in the United States, the federal government after World War I tried to maintain an institutionalized system of litigation for labor rights overseen by the War Labor Board. The board had 5 employee, 5 employer representatives each, and 2 public appointees, and it heard labor dispute appeals like a court. But then when the Republicans re-entered the White House in 1919, employers ignored the awards and President Harding shut it down. Second, Britain set up joint industrial councils where unions and employers settled fair wage scales, institutionalizing sectoral collective bargaining. But then, when the Conservatives retook control of the government in 1922, in its pursuit of austerity and cuts, the councils lost their power. Third, in Germany, the unions and industrialists after the war concluded one of history's greatest ever collective agreements, the Stinslegian Abkommen, written into the Weimar Constitution by the great European labor lawyer Hugo Sinsheimer. Article 165 of the Weimar Constitution said that workers and employers would cooperate on an equal footing in the entire field of economic development of the forces of production. While in power, the Social Democrats passed a new Work Council law New Work Council Act of 1920, giving elected work councils rights to cooperate in setting work conditions, managing pensions, and to veto unjustified dismissals. However, the Social Democrats left questions of wider socialization of enterprise to a commission, and corporate board reform was unfinished before they lost office. A board representation law was passed in 1922, but much watered down. So you see, matters were very different back then, a century ago. American labor ran into the ground with litigation and government shutdowns. British labor faced austerity and cuts. German labor had high ideals, but it all got delayed in a commission. And they were in a global pandemic. What a completely different world it was then. But of course, rights in litigation, sectoral collective bargaining, and the right to vote at work were not alternatives. They were complements. And there were experiments across politics. In Britain, Winston Churchill had already piloted a worker representation plan on the board of the Port of London Authority. And after the war, a Conservative Minister for Transport was proposing 1/3 worker representation on railway boards, just like they were already doing in Switzerland. In America, Andrew Carnegie helped establish the first widespread university pension plan with representation for staff beneficiaries. And that's now the jointly managed Teachers Insurance and Annuity Association, or TIA. J.D. Rockefeller hired Canada's future Prime Minister, William Lyon Mackenzie King, to develop a work council plan where questions of affecting conditions of employment could be discussed. And in 1919, the governor of Massachusetts and future Republican president, Calvin Coolidge, passed a voluntary board co-determination law for manufacturing companies, and it's still in force today. It was only the fascists that could not accept the right to vote at work. Just as they torched Parliament and torched public enterprise, they torched the unions and votes at work. Their Stock Corporation Act of 1937 codified a bank cartel agreement to take over shareholder voting rights to secure total economic control. As the head of the Nazi Labour Front said, workers were part of the plant community which obeys the leader blindly. Its motto is, "The leader is always right." And so if anyone was still unsure about what industrial democracy then meant by then, well, it was everything that the fascists opposed. So the Universal Declaration enshrined the opposite. Everyone has the right, it said, to take part in government. Property was a human right as well, but now it was just one amongst many, and it was not for corporations holding property for production. Rights came from membership, not contract. Everyone, it said, as a member of society, has the right to social security, as well as fair pay, leisure, the union, and to strike. And crucially, everyone has the right to share in scientific advancement and its benefits. This came from experience in the New Deal, both in distributing a polio vaccine and electrifying rural America. Private enterprise tended to restrict supply out of apathy or profit or both, so positive action, saw the Roosevelt government, was needed. And today this affects everything from distributing a COVID-19 vaccine to ending climate damage from coal, oil and gas as fast as technology allows with a just transition, and to Labour getting a fair share of what we make. The Universal Declaration marked the beginning of a global revolution, a constitution of humanity, but it didn't tell us how we realize these rights, the governance structures that would deliver us social security, fair pay, or the benefits of science. Of course, minimum standards could be juridically or judicially enforceable in court. And in the 1950s, a quip was that people were now moving back from status to contract, from contract back to status, and that it was the same thing all over again, like a regression. The student of Hugo Sinsheimer, another great European labour lawyer, Otto Kahn-Freund, firmly scotched that notion, pointing out that far from fixing the status, the very point of rights is to give people flexibility to agree what they want beyond a minimum. And the way that we ensure fair standards beyond the minimum is to be a member with democratic voice, collective bargaining, and the vote. So, the movement of progressive societies today has become a movement from contract to membership. The consent-based element of a contract is still a part of becoming a member in a social institution like an employer organized in corporate form. But the terms of work are set by a constitutional relationship, ultimately set by all members in the group. It is, like the great Harry Arthurs has put it, industrial citizenship. The core of membership is that in principle we all stand upon an equal foot. And since access to membership is based on consent, not money, the right to vote is no longer just a part of property, but a most transcendent thing. As it happens, two recent cases in Canada and Britain illustrate the transcendence of rights over contract. Last year, in Uber Technologies and Heller, the Canadian Supreme Court held that regardless of the contract, Uber's drivers could claim employment rights in Canadian courts, not, as the contract said, go to some sham arbitration in Holland. The majority said that such a term would be unconscionable and void. And unconscionability was crucially based on unequal bargaining power between the drivers and the firm. And like Adam Smith said, this begins with differences in wealth. And just last month, the UK Supreme Court held in Uber BV and Aslam that drivers are workers at least entitled to the minimum wage and paid holidays for all the time that they switch on the app, regardless of what a contract says. The contract, held the Supreme Court, is not even a starting point, written as it is by Uber's armies of lawyers. In sum, what Juliet Shaw has called the halo of positive feeling that the so-called sharing economy tries to create, that glitzy rhetoric of techno-utopia, was seen as a fraud. The Uber cases make clear that a real sharing economy is not one based on apps and spin, a dishonest business model, tax evasion, or predatory pricing. A real sharing economy is based on human rights, and those include the right to social security, fair pay, to organize, and ultimately the vote. So now, let's unpack the three main ways that the future of democracy is unfolding today, and why, with votes at work, in votes in capital, and votes in public services. This has come from collective bargaining, from ideas, and simply from experience that our economic constitution must improve. First, votes at work. Those mean the right to vote for a governing board of an enterprise, an elected work council with binding rights in management, or both. A majority of the richest countries in the OECD now have some kind of law requiring workers vote for directors in corporate boardrooms. For example, Sweden requires around a third of boards are worker or union elected in companies with over 25 staff. Germany requires that just under 1/2 of supervisory boards in companies with over 2,000 staff are worker or union elected. And both systems are embedded in sectoral collective bargaining, so that staff have voice within an enterprise while fair pay scales are agreed across an industry to prevent unfair competition. This is the best way to raise pay, productivity, happiness, and innovation. And there's three main kinds of evidence. First, there's behavioral evidence. Already in 1968, Paul Bloomberg recounted, old sociologist, recounted the old story of an Australian researcher from Harvard called Elton Mayo at the Hawthorne Works. As the story goes, Mayo took a group of workers out of the factory into a lab and fiddled with the lighting as they did their shifts, hoping to show that light intensity would improve production, and it didn't. But the one sure finding was that workers were happier and more productive in the lab and not in the factory. Bloomberg explained that this was because they were away from the boss, and the researchers asked staff how they wanted to organize their shifts and breaks. And this illustrates what the great economist Herbert Simon called the participation hypothesis, that people will work and change positively when they participate in deciding what the change shall be and how it shall be made. Second, there's quantitative evidence. For example, in 2013, Professors Acharya, Baghai, and Subramanian showed that job security rights, including co-determination, have a significant positive impact on innovation. What they did is they based their study on data of the evolution in 5 countries' laws from the Cambridge Centre for Business Research. And they found that the number of patents filed goes up a lot when you have stronger job security laws. And I suppose that reflects the theory that people are going to experiment and innovate when they have security. And the strongest job security laws, of course, give staff the right to vote for directors and elect works councils that can veto or delay unjustified dismissals. Now, the Cambridge Centre for Business Research has expanded its database to not just 5, but 117 countries, with 40 indicators of labour law changes since 1970. We can see better labour rights, including board representation and work councils, increase employment, decrease unemployment, and raise labour's share of national income. Third, there is qualitative evidence. Clearly meaningful votes at work invite high participation. In Germany, voter turnouts for work council elections are around 70 or 80%, and that's as high as federal elections or higher. Votes at work also reduce conflict, including strikes, by promoting information exchange, trust, and confidence. And so to take just one example of this, the great Lynn Williams bargained for worker representation on 5 steel company boards for 6 years in 1993. He saw it as part of making an investment, in his words, an investment in companies to ensure those struggling had an economically viable plan and to share in the financial gains when companies became profitable again. As Lynn Williams said in 1999, we must not forget, we must continue to build on the strategic approaches to collective bargaining. We must never forget how important the quality of management is to our members and their future, and how important it is that we have input across the range of the corporation, shop floor, management levels, strategic planning, and board of directors. And this evidence, and evidence like it, is driving reform across English-speaking countries and political parties. Like Churchill's Port of London Act or the early railway proposals, in 2016, our own Conservative government proposed worker representation on boards. It was watered down into a sort of comply-or-explain law in the UK Corporate Governance Code for listed companies, but it's a start. And the British Labour Party, in which I played a part, is also committed to reform. We have a draft law, the Democratic Society Act, that would create a default right to vote for workers in the general meetings of every company startup. And when companies reach over 250 staff, companies would have to have at least 1/3 of the board being worker elected. One worker, one vote. And in the United States, Senator Tammy Baldwin released the Reward Work Act to ensure employees can elect at least 1/3 of listed company boards. Then Elizabeth Warren proposed that $1 billion companies should have 40% of their boards elected by employees. And then Bernie Sanders, not to be outdone, proposed $100 million companies should have 45% of their boards elected by employees. These are federal proposals, and it's significant. These are federal proposals, but every democratic state right now, like California, New York, Massachusetts, Delaware, could amend their corporate laws today. Kamala Harris has joined calls for a Securities and Exchange Commission investigation into worker representation. And Barack Obama has said it is, quote, a good new idea. So this is a really big deal because we need a clean slate for labor rights, and votes at work are entirely established in American tradition, not just for Democrats. Opinion polls show also that there's majority support for votes at work among Republicans. As former Republican Senator Jacob K. Javits said, an effort to open up corporate boardroom opportunities to workers would improve workers' understanding of management as well as exposing management to workers' ideas. The only politics that cannot support votes at work is fascism. And if we want proof that it works, we just need to look at universities. Combining the majority staff election models of Cambridge and Oxford and the alumni election models, a model of Harvard, the University of Toronto Act of 1971 requires roughly 1/3, a little bit less, of the governing council is elected by staff, and 1/3 for alumni and students, and then the same again for the lieutenant governor. And this system isn't perfect, but everyone at Toronto should get involved and run because your council controls how you work, how all the budgets are made, or where your endowment fund is invested. And I'll give you an example of that. At Cambridge University, an incredible scholar, Dr. Ellen Quigley, who originally happens to be from Saskatoon, organized for the university's funds to divest from fossil fuels. And good, because coal, oil, and gas have been the worst performing investments every year since 2017. They're hurting our pensions, and they must end because we need to end climate damage. Votes at work, the fundamental point, votes at work are common to the world's best universities. And let me tell you about my own workplace, King's College London. Around a third of our governing council was elected by staff until 2009, when the votes were unilaterally abolished. So we started a petition last year to have majority elected by staff and students again. There's nearly 800 signatures to the petition, which you can see at www.kclisdemocratic.net. And these signatories are committed to democratizing work, as well as our students' union. So is our workplace union. And at the same time, we are concluding our first written collective agreement in over a decade. And we're seeing really positive, genuine engagement from our university chair, the chair of the council, and our principal. Our case is that our workplace will be better for everyone when staff have votes again. We propose different options for change to our university's constitution, and now we're consulting all staff. Support will continue to mount, but even before legislation, this could be done at every workplace as well as universities, with moral persuasion, engagement, and collective bargaining for corporate change. So now the second main element of a democratic economy, votes in capital. Workers' capital makes up most of the stock market, from pensions, life insurance, or mutual funds, but there are two big problems. First, not all funds have directors elected by the beneficiaries and workers. Second, pensions often delegate investment services to asset managers or banks, and these asset managers or banks cast the votes on shares that workers' capital buys. Simply describing this situation shows how absurd it is. In the United States, the big three asset managers, BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, if combined, would be the largest shareholder in 438 out of the top 500 corporations. They've got around 50 people working in their corporate governance departments, casting all the votes on all those company shares. Their vote policies are controlled by the chief fund directors, probably around 12 people, and their preferences conflict with the real investors. The big three hold 20% of the shares in the oil giants that are burning our planet, and they have done nothing but greenwash to replace fossil fuels as fast as technologically possible. They have done nothing to end the gender pay gap. They pay themselves astronomical bonuses with fees extracted from pensioners, and they oppose living wages and unions across the board. They especially oppose collective defined benefit pensions because, as Professor David Weber at Boston University says, they're intent on smashing and scattering everyone's savings into individual accounts so that they can earn more fees or take more fees. And who are they accountable to? Well, if you look at the share registers, BlackRock's biggest shareholders are Vanguard, BlackRock itself, and State Street. Vanguard's insiders control themselves, and State Street's biggest holders are Vanguard and BlackRock. This is a self-perpetuating oligarchy. Worse still are the big three private banks in Germany, Deutsche Bank, Commerzbank, and UniCredit. Before public statistics were cancelled in 2005, the banks were shown to be exercising around 60% of the voting rights of German public company shares. They have done this since they formed a cartel to take over other people's votes in 1930, and the Nazi Stock Corporation Act of 1937 codified this bank power into law, and it's still not been reversed today, though it probably does violate EU competition law. These financialized institutions, these asset managers and banks threaten fair competition, they threaten our planet, fair pay and equality, and all of their power comes from other people's money. The good news is that there are excellent models for reform. First, in Canada, the best pensions are collectively bargained with at least equal employer and employee representation. I read about the new Ontario University Pension Plan. It's a fine example and designed to protect defined benefit pensions. In the UK, we require at least 1/3 member-nominated trustees on pension boards, and the minister can raise this threshold to 1/2 at any time. I hope they will do that soon. The Canada-based Committee on Workers' Capital has also done some brilliant work in organising pension trustees' voices worldwide. Second, in Switzerland, a 2013 reform required that banks only vote on shares based upon instructions from pension funds, and pension funds have a duty to formulate voting policy for shares. And in 2019, the Bernie Sanders campaign, which I had the privilege of working with, proposed in its corporate accountability and democracy plan that asset managers or banks, whatever the form, should only vote based on instructions from their clients. As it said, the voting power asset managers control comes from other people's money. It doesn't belong to them, it belongs to us. And when people control their capital, they use it well. For example, in 2010, a phenomenal woman called Janice Turner organised an association of member-nominated trustees for the UK's elected and union pension representatives. In 2016, the AMNT produced a superb document on how asset managers should cast votes on pension money called Red Line Voting. This requires, for example, that shares are voted against directors of companies if they don't disclose a plan to end coal, oil and gas, reach gender parity in boardrooms, pay living wages, recognize an independent union, or have directors earning over 100 times the average worker. London asset managers are still refusing to follow these instructions, and uniformly so. This suggests they're either acting as an illegal cartel or there is a market failure that invites regulation. Our pensions minister has set up a working group to look at this very issue in December, and I hope that it's going to make big steps forward very soon. But what all of this shows is that the solutions are already there before us. We need to take back our votes in capital. Now, the third main element of economic democracy is votes in public services. Many major enterprises are not suited to shares traded in among capital investors. Nobody really wants to nationalize fashion, electronics, or craft beer production because we know competitive private enterprise can advance the public interest if there is broadly equal distribution of assets and finance for production. But where we're talking about education, health, banking, water, the electricity grid, transport, or communications networks, when left to the capital market, these enterprises always fail. In nearly every country, they have been taken into public ownership, in whole or in part, or put under sector-specific regulation, or members of the public have binding rights, or all three. When voting with your feet as a consumer no longer works, what a democratic society does is it creates voting for real. We're not yet fully past the old Morrisonian model of nationalisation, where expert ministers, like the old Transport Secretary Herbert Morrison, where the ministers monopolise appointments to boards of public enterprises. But this is changing. First, there's universities, again like Toronto, which illustrate the success of including student and alumni votes in governance. That doesn't solve everything because we're still not realising the universal right that higher education should be made equally accessible to all by the progressive introduction of free education as international law requires. But whether the funding is from forced fees or from fair tax, students still need a voice and a vote. Second, in the best health systems, including in Spain or even the National Health Service in the UK, we see patients and residents groups alongside doctors and nurses having the right to vote for hospital boards. Third, in public services, from water to electricity to transport, in France, Germany, or Switzerland, we see ratepayers, local residents, and passengers having the right to co-determine the management of their services. Fourth, in communication and media, staff and audiences often have the right to vote. My favorite example is Wikimedia, which runs one of the world's biggest websites, Wikipedia. Incorporated in Florida, half of its board is elected by editors and readers. Anyone can register an account and get a vote. Editors also determine Wikipedia's policies. These include good faith dialogue, no harassment or bullying, no bots or sock puppets, and accurate and impartial information. This contrasts with Facebook, which, to its credit, originally gave users the right to vote on its privacy policy. But then, ahead of its 2011 initial public offering, Facebook unilaterally abolished its users' votes. In the drive for money from ads. It then enabled user data to be harvested without people's consent by the psycho-ops companies like Cambridge Analytica and Aggregate IQ. That data fueled the psychologically targeted propaganda in the Brexit, Ted Cruz, and Trump 2016 campaigns. So you see that the right to vote really does matter. Votes create a truly social media, and they're part of a true system of democratic enterprise. There is, however, a different view. A dwindling minority of corporate law theorists still argue that our economic constitution should exalt shareholder primacy and value. On this view, shareholders should monopolize the votes in the economy, and this is the end of history for corporate law. Especially from the 1970s, this minority view, starting with Milton Friedman, challenged the long-standing consensus that the great New Dealers like A.A. Burley and Gardner Means had maintained that corporations are social institutions which should act in the public interest. No, said Friedman, the social responsibility of corporations is to make profit for shareholders. But why? Well, Friedman's reasons were never really coherent, simply asserting that shareholders are owners of corporations, and that gets private property completely wrong because shareholders own their shares, not a corporation. But then in 1979, Michael Jensen and Bill Meckling argued that because a shareholder is supposedly the residual claimant on a firm's cash flows, the party to be paid last on a corporation's bankruptcy, the shareholder is likely to be the best monitor, and workers or others will be far less efficient in corporate governance. In 1983, Frank Easterbrook and Daniel Fishel argued that shareholders monopolize votes because voting flows with the residual interest in the firm, and if the law does anything else, there will be needless agency costs of management. In 1984, Oliver Williamson said that shareholders make the only asset-specific investments in corporations that can't be protected unless they are appointing the whole board. Workers' interests could be protected with job security, but the capital is always at hazard. And in 1996, Henry Hansman, who I respect a great deal, argued that because shareholders all want profit and workers or the public have divergent interests, shareholder monopolized boards will fight less and be better. And this was the end of history for corporate law. So the primary intellectual justification for shareholder monopoly rested on the notion that shareholders invest money in companies. Their money is at risk. They have the incentives to manage best. But none of this is remotely true, because shareholders today and back in the 70s, 80s, and 90s are mainly asset managers and banks. They don't invest their own money. They take votes from other people's money. They have fundamental conflicts of interest with the real investors. And even where shareholders are the real investors, the job risks that workers face when they invest their labor are greater. So are the risks to the public of bankrupt banks, of health that does not care, of trains that do not run, or of ad-driven surveillance websites. In any case, the very point of a constitutional governance structure is not, as Oliver Wendell Holmes once said, to embody an evidence-free theory of economics, but to reconcile people of fundamentally different views. The public must vote where markets fail. The real capital investors often should vote, and workers always. And history did not end with shareholder primacy, and good, because it has accelerated inequality, it's burning our planet, and it bankrolls the industries of war. On the positive side, there is a steady spread of votes in the economy. But on the negative side, the spirit of fascism has re-emerged in big business. It is now said that the only shareholders who should have votes are the entrepreneurial founders of companies. To take just one example, Zuckerberg at Facebook took multiple voting shares, and he can't be removed. As he became the world's third biggest ad man, Zuckerberg argued against any standards at all. Let Nazis deny the Holocaust to mass audience. On Facebook, he said, people should be allowed to get things wrong, that's Holocaust to now, get things wrong even multiple times, while Facebook profits from the ads. He has only changed his mind after the genocide in Myanmar, televised mass shootings, and the national terrorist attack on the US Capitol. Nobody can hold Zuckerberg to account until we restore not just user votes, but also the one share, one vote laws that we had from the New Deal. And this matters in the UK, and it might matter soon in Canada as well, because our Financial Conduct Authority is considering allowing dual-class share structures for listed companies, egged on by the food delivery company Deliveroo. Like Uber, Deliveroo also misrepresents the employment status of its staff. Dual-class shares for this or any other company, I would suggest, like an old phone, are not smart. Finally, there's the argument that workers should become shareholders. Shareholder primacy is fine, it's said, so long as workers and capitalists are pulling and owning the same boat. This argument has long been made by Richard Friedman, who adds that if robots, more recently, are taking our jobs, then we should just own the robots and do it through share schemes. I've got some sympathy for this argument, and there are lots of employee share plans that have worked, but it can be quickly seen that what really matters is not shares in a single firm, but the vote in how technology is used and the benefits shared. There is nothing inherently wrong with workers having some shares in a company, except that it should never be a substitute for actual pay or rights. And we must be very clear that employee share schemes break the cardinal rule of investment, which is that you've got to diversify your portfolio. For example, the American energy company, Enron, bankrupted in 2001, encouraged its staff to invest their pensions in its share scheme. And when it went down, workers lost around 2/3 of their pension savings. Any big employee share scheme risks violating the universal right to social security. Share schemes have always been used to divide and screw workers with disastrous results, from Thatcher's privatization of the British buses to post-Soviet shock therapy that gave us the Russian oligarchs. Workers are entitled to a vote and stable pay without shares. And the best shareholding entities are pension funds and other diverse democratic ownership funds. And if we want to become a democratic economy, what matters is the vote. So, what is the future of democracy and work? The answer must be it's people at work, savers for retirement, and all members of our society. The true investors in the wealth of nations are the future. We've moved away from a society based on property and contract, and we're perfecting one now based on universal rights and membership. We simply need to see our economic constitution for what it is. There is no moral or intellectual justification for letting a tiny group of men, like the heads of BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, monopolize the votes in our economy. Their control over corporations is hurting us. It's hurting our planet and our democracy. So we just need to build on the good models that we already know. And I want you to just imagine for a second what the world could be like once we overcome these temporary problems. Instead of a life so dreary to the contemplative mind, a life of struggling to pay the bills, of coal fumes and car fumes, and of relentless conflict in our airwaves and in our minds, we can raise everyone's pay, clean the air, and have a society that lives in peace. Imagine if everyone had a more democratic workplace. When things go wrong, we all get a vote to set it right. Imagine if all the big financial firms, instead of shouting about quarterly profits and concealing their annual fees, use their power to raise pay, go green, and support human rights. Imagine if the big tech monopolies, instead of monetizing your eyeballs and your data, became part of a network of universal public services. The benefits of our technology, which would be shared by everybody, we could use to ensure that we extend our weekends and our holidays, our childhoods and our retirement, and our freedom to enjoy what is truly valuable in life: friends, family, sport, music, art, literature, philosophy, and contemplating the wonders of our world and our existence. We've all felt at times how much we miss these things in this pandemic. And as we come out of COVID-19, we need a green recovery and a social recovery. And we also need a political recovery. We need to change the paradigm of our economic constitution with that familiar friend and that most transcendent thing: one person, one vote. Thank you so much for listening, and I'm very happy to take questions.
Wow, Ewan, I don't even know where to start. There was so much in that talk, and in some ways there are several questions in the Q&A saying, is this going to be recorded? Can we get the transcript? I want to go back and really think through and reread some some of your thoughts. And so I believe that you said that you would send me the transcript after. We can make that available alongside the recording so that people in the audience can go back and listen, because there was really so much in what you said. And just, I think, incredible how you can go in and out of the law and history and politics and political philosophy, as well as sort of the history of industrial relations thought in such a short period of time. I'm going to maybe kick it off with a question that came to me as I was listening to what you were saying, and then we'll turn to some questions from the audience. One of the things that I have done a lot of research on is cooperative governance. And let's say I can buy everything that you've said, the argument for why we need to democratize in all these areas. It does, I think, leave the very real problem about participation. And there are lots of examples of, I come from a place in Canada that is, there's a lot, it almost seems like there's a lot more co-ops, consumer co-ops, worker co-ops, multi-stakeholder co-ops, and even publicly owned organizations of major public utilities than almost any other kind of organization. There's a few big corporations, but the vast majority of Saskatchewan, I think there's a lot of cooperative history there and publicly owned entities. And there's a lot of questions about participation in these organizations that have long histories. There's questions about scale, the 1/n problem in terms of voting, and apathy that has built up over time in these very, very democratic organizations, as well as, in addition to whether or not the people that are elected by the people who elect them actually represent their interests, and whether or not they're actually making any different decisions than so-called capitalists would be. And so it's just a really pragmatic question about how likely this kind of approach could be, broad scale, or if it really is just an approach that will kind of temper the really, really bad parts about capitalism by providing an option, but not all workers or citizens might actually take it up. I don't know if that question is very clear, but how realistic is it as a way for people to participate?
That's a really important question. So the first thing is that in order to have an organization well run, what you really need is an active core of organized people. I mean, people in the trade union move this. You need an active core. But it's also clear, and this is why I gave the example about German Work Council turnout. If people have something meaningful to vote for, they do. And when people don't feel that participation is meaningful, they don't bother. So, the two things that we've got to do, to make sure that people participate, and then to overcome the collective action problem, is ensure that people have meaningful rights at work. And also that, the right to vote at work needs to be backed up by organization in the workplace through trade unions. If we were talking about public services and consumers, you mentioned cooperatives. There is a similar problem where there is often a lack of sort of organizations that organize the voice of consumers or otherwise disparate groups. But so the labor movement, I think, is a good example of how that's done.
Okay, thank you. There's a couple of questions in the chat. Is there a country whose model you currently believe might be on the right track? I think New Zealand has started to review the measurements it uses to define its economy and productivity differently, but I don't know much about that.
That's a really interesting point, because one of the things that we do is we measure economic success and performance by gross domestic product a lot of the time. And gross domestic product is, about adding up all the contract values, roughly speaking, in the economy. And it includes things that might be actively damaging. I mean, I think a really good example is America spends, 2 or 3 times the amount of money on healthcare and gets worse outcomes in terms of life expectancy than the UK. But it looks like the extra spending on healthcare in America is good for GDP, and good for society. When it's not, it's actively harming. So the moves that New Zealand is making to reevaluate or an alternative model to GDP, I think is very important. One thing that we could do is we could replace. This is something that we proposed in a Green Recovery Act, is that we replace GDP with the Inequality Adjusted Human Development Index, but we also remove GDP from the Human Development Index and replace that with real wages. Because profits can be good or bad, but real wages are a very, very good descriptor of people's actual welfare.
Okay, thanks. Another question that I think builds a little bit on what maybe articulates better what I was also, one of the other questions I was trying to raise was, if the argument for the vote as panacea can be overcast. So do we also need to think of safeguards for when the vote goes wrong? So when majorities vote for the wrong things. So as one example, fascism can also come to power through votes, as history shows, and we're witnessing again in many countries. Are similar parallels not also possible in all the areas of voting you are arguing for? And should there be safeguards?
Yes. Look, that's a really good point. So it's important to understand, as the labor lawyers in Germany did at the time, particularly Otto Kahn-Freund, that fascism wasn't something that just happened with a bang in 1933. Fascism was a state of mind that was particularly prevalent in the judiciary and the people that allowed the concentration of power into the hands of big business, the monopolization of every shareholder voting right by the banks. And they are the people that bankrolled Hitler and created the conditions for fascism. And so you take somebody like Trump. Trump is, not just an entity to himself, but he's embedded in an extremist set of networks, of big business support, and of course, the cyber warfare by the Kremlin, as documented comprehensively in the Mueller report. So, I think that it's right to say absolutely that, just saying one person, one vote is not going to solve every problem. But it is a very, very important part of the solution. So democracy is so much more than the vote. A deliberative democracy also depends on lots of other institutions to organize voice, like trade unions, or to ensure that there's free speech and proper deliberation, an honest and accountable and plural media. So it's an excellent point.
Okay, another question. How can you solve the problem of information asymmetry that exists? Voting in itself is not enough. For instance, the example of the many US citizens who believed the election was stolen.
Yes. Well, so that's a pack of lies, and the problem is that you have one major news network in the United States, Fox News, which actively lies to its audiences and distorts information. And we've got to look at media ownership laws, right? Thomas Piketty has just written another big book called Capital and Ideology, where he talks about some of the problems of media ownership and how you can create a more democratic media. In my view, I think Wikipedia and Wikimedia gives a very good illustration of what can be done. A good media organization doesn't have, the owner dictating to the editors of the news organization what their policy line will be. A good media organization gives voice to journalists, to determine the editorial policy. And when you've got that, then you have less of a risk that somebody like Rupert Murdoch tells a vast number of papers and television stations to pursue a particular line to suit his business interests. So I think that's a very important discussion that we need to have more of.
There's a question about education, and it's framed around that the early childhood education is poor, and that education through high school is not improving. And in Ontario, there's a movement to make education online, depriving kids of social environment to bounce ideas and challenge each other. So the question is, what can we do to improve education? But I think maybe in the context of your talk, how do you actually create, embed these kinds of ideas in early education or in high schools or in the kind of context in which we have an education system right now?
That's another big question. As well as being a labor lawyer, I'm trying to finish a book on I'm calling it Principles of Enterprise Law, and it includes education governance. And I don't really have anything but a very sketchy answer thought out to that. But my initial response is that, sometimes online education can be a good thing. It can reach mass audiences, and in a globalizing world, it's got to be good that there are more options available. At early ages of childhood, I don't think that there's any substitute whatsoever for human contact. There is no way that teachers and classrooms can be substituted with online learning. Distance classes for adult learning, perhaps in universities of certain kinds. I also convene an external program for the University of London. It could be a good thing. But it has to be very, very carefully thought through, and any transition has to be done in the interests of staff and students, and them driving the policies to suit them. It can't just be a sort of moneymaker for university managers that aren't accountable.
So this is a long question, but I'll try and maybe condense it a little bit. It's about, even though there's a lot of ways that democracy has contributed to improving labor conditions and rights of employees, that there's also negative aspects of how unions and union members have tried to implement their rights. So how school boards hire teachers and staff based on seniority and union membership is problematic for talented immigrants when they first come to Canada, or looking for not hiring necessarily the best people, but you need to know someone internally. So this person's asking, does that sound democratic? And how can we get rid of these kinds of undemocratic elements that might exist within trade unions?
Look, I think that that's an important point. And I think that, a union, like a government, is only ever going to be as good as the people involved in it. And so the best thing that we can do, as a labor lawyer myself and somebody who's a member of a trade union, the best thing that we can do is have good models to follow. And, so far as trade union democracy goes, I think that we can, as a labor movement, look at what are the best models that create the most inclusive, equal, welcoming kinds of union movements that don't do the sort of things that sadly we've sometimes seen in the past. So good models are really important, and that's about publicizing best practice. But ultimately, that's going to come down to an ethic and a set of principles that are founded on universal human rights: the right to equality, fair pay, social security, and also the right to vote.
Okay, and somebody asking along the lines of how to break the current cycle we're in, of the concentration of wealth in the hands of fewer and fewer of the super rich. Obviously, your entire talk has been a little bit about how to break this cycle, but what would be, say, the first step in terms of moving forward, if you were going to give advice for how to do that?
Yes, I think, gosh, that's a good question. I think that the first step is that you've got to stop inequality escalating. So at the moment, it's still escalating, right? It's still the case, especially after the pandemic, that we're driving this sort of centripetal force to more and more power being accumulated, and that power being used to accumulate more wealth. Wealth begets power, and power begets wealth. So what you've got to do is change the internal structure of our economic constitution. And it's about power. Now, it's not only about power, and so changing who has the right to vote. And the thing that I really want to stress throughout this talk is that the people who currently control power are completely illegitimate. The big shareholders and asset managers and banks. There is no rational defense for a tiny group of people with other people's money controlling all the votes in the economy. It can't be defended because it is just so indefensible. What you will probably see as we continue to have this argument is, different kinds of justifications, but none of them are going to work. But so that is something that you can do to solve the escalating income inequality that that we see. There's also a problem of wealth inequality, right? So, changing current incomes will change future accumulations of wealth. But I think there have been some very important proposals about taxing wealth. And that's something that we should look at a great deal more.
Somebody has a specific question about the UK. Theresa May had mentioned the possibility of employee participation in governance post-Brexit. What's the status of those proposals?
Well, Professor Bodie, that's an excellent question. Well, what happened is that Theresa May said, we want workers and consumers to be on company boards in 2016 when she was doing her leadership election. And to her great credit, she put some she put some of the gears in motion, but unfortunately it got watered down, and because of just the all-consuming argument about Brexit, it ended up being much watered down than it should have been. What we've got at the moment is an amendment to the UK Corporate Governance Code that says that listed companies have to comply or explain with one of 3 different worker options. And one of these includes, maybe appointing a worker to a board, but it doesn't really say how. So, it's not there yet, but I think it's important that we have established the principle. And this is very much on the agenda. And I would also point out that it was actually the Conservative Party in 1995 in the Pensions Act that first codified this right of pension trustees to be elected by employees or union appointed. And that came from experience of collective agreements that trade unions made. So you have this sort of flow of experimentation, particularly through collective bargainings, and then good ideas get codified into laws, and then they get strengthened when they work. And so we just need to do that more. We need to follow the good models, and we need to spread them around. As I say, every American state could do it. I think that Canada could get behind votes at work. The University of Toronto Act of 1971 was passed after all.
So one last question, and it's about China, about the influence of rising China and its work model. And this person is saying that the Chinese population shows more support for its government model than most other countries. So with the rise of China and their models, have you given any thought to how that would influence anything that you're thinking about?
I'm very, very glad that you raised that. So, I mean, obviously the starting point is that China is not a democracy. It's a totalitarian state. They've been suppressing democratic protests in Hong Kong. They have committed awful crimes against the Uyghur people. But China is also huge, and it has done incredible things to raise hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. And so there are incredible debates going on that we don't often see within the Chinese Communist Party about many, many different directions for reform. And very interestingly, China is a country that actually has references to co-determination, the right to vote, embedded in its laws. It has done for a long time. I mean, in an authoritarian regime, laws on the books aren't actually what happens, but it's there. And so we can have this debate in every single country at every stage of development, as a lot of countries in Europe did. I would also add that India has a right of co-determination in its constitution as well. It hasn't realized that through implementing laws yet, but the idea is embedded there, and so does Brazil. So, I think that there is capacity for the growth of this idea that we've got a right to vote in the economic constitution worldwide, and I think it would be a very good thing.
Okay, unfortunately, we are really close to being out of time, and there were 2 more really interesting questions, or 3 more interesting questions that we weren't able to get to, but maybe you can read them and give them some thought, Ewan. I just want to take the opportunity before we sign off at 4:30 to really thank you for putting what was obviously a ton of thought into your lecture. And I, for one, am joining the audience and being really looking forward to being able to actually read it again and really digest everything that you had to offer in that talk. I'd also like to once again congratulate our co-recipients of the Sefton-Williams Memorial Lecture Memorial Award for contributions in labor relations, John O'Grady and Ken Delaney, and thank you for your lovely remarks at the beginning. I'd also like to thank the Sefton-Williams Speaker and Award Selection Committee, and there are 12 people on that committee who select the speaker and also the award recipient, so I'm not going to name them all, but I'm sure they're all out in the audience, and so thank you all for your service every year on this committee. I'd also like to thank Stephanie Woodside for her assistance with the logistics and the planning. She's in the background somewhere here. And Kate McLeod for her excellent communication design and marketing work in advertising this talk and putting everything up on the website and making sure that everybody knows how to get here. And finally, just to thank you, the audience. I know that there's a lot of demands on your time these days, and we have the nice thing about these virtual lectures is we are able to have record numbers attending the Sefton talk, and also that we're able to tape it to be able to go back and listen to it and have other people hear the talk as well. So with that, thank you all for taking the time to join us today, and I will hopefully see you all in person at some point soon.
So first is, what do you think of Amazon that prevents its employees from unionizing against their rights, like paid sickness leave? I think that Amazon should give everyone fair pay in a union. Raquel asks, through pensions and investments, we're all implicated in the shareholder dilemma and prioritizing profits by any means necessary. How can we change the asset manager big bang culture and still protect against financial security in old age when our government pensions are not enough? Oh, that's a really good question. So the reason that our pensions are not enough is because asset managers and banks are taking so much in fees. So stock markets are bigger in countries with smaller public pension funds and bigger workplace pension funds, because people's money has to be invested in the stock market. And so Wall Street and the City of London are so big because occupational pensions are bigger, right? So they do everything they can to take fees, and what we've got to do is probably just put all the money into index-linked funds, minus fossil fuels, and take it in-house. You actually don't need asset managers. And then Mark asks, a stimulating presentation. Generally, your remedies require participation in organizations where people work for pay, but in some of the most advanced economies, the working population is larger than the labor force. Wouldn't your ideas for shareholder and other kinds of stakeholder democracy require schemes to distribute corporate shares more widely so that citizens feel that they have a tangible stake? Yeah, Mark, that is stake in, oh, there's more, in the outcomes that they might vote on. I'll just answer that, Mark. Yeah. So, and what evidence is that the public cares? So yeah, what you've got to do is, pension fund investments should be diversified across a large group of workers. And the Labour Party also proposed, and the Bernie Sanders campaign also proposed, democratic ownership funds, like sovereign wealth funds that could be used to diversify the benefits to many, many people. So that's really important. You ensure that capital is diversified and lots of people sharing the benefits. I think we're done.